It is the night of 14th May, 1940, in a converted workshop tucked behind the Ministry of Supply in Whitehall, and a small group of men are standing rather further back from a table than the experiment strictly requires. On the table sits a glass sphere, roughly the size of a grapefruit, wrapped in wool and coated in something resembling treacle. Outside, the news from France is getting worse by the hour. The British Expeditionary Force is being pushed towards the coast, and somewhere across the Channel, German Panzer divisions are advancing faster than anyone in London had thought possible. Inside this workshop, the problem is rather more immediate. Somebody has to find out what happens when this peculiar glass ball is thrown at a steel plate. A young engineer named Stuart McCrae nods to a colleague. The ball is hurled. It strikes the plate, sticks fast with an audible, slightly comic thwack, and after 5 long seconds detonates with a crack that rattles the windows. Nobody is hurt. Nobody is entirely relieved either, because they all understand, in that instant, that they have just created something that behaves less like a conventional weapon and more like an extremely angry piece of flypaper. It works. It also, they will soon discover, has an unfortunate habit of working on the wrong target. This is the birth of what would become known officially as the Grenade, Hand, Anti-Tank No. 74, and unofficially by every soldier and home guardsman unlucky enough to be issued one as the sticky bomb. It is a weapon born of desperation, built around an idea so simple it sounds almost like a children's prank. Take a ball of high explosive, cover it in the strongest adhesive available, and throw it at a tank. If it sticks, the tank dies. If it sticks to you instead, you have roughly 5 seconds to solve a rather different problem. What makes this story worth telling is not simply that the sticky bomb was dangerous, because plenty of wartime weapons were dangerous by design. What makes it remarkable is that it was dangerous by accident. In a way, its own inventors recognized almost immediately and never fully managed to fix. And yet, it was manufactured by the millions and issued anyway, because Britain in the summer of 1940 had run out of better options. To understand why a government would knowingly hand its citizens a bomb that might attach itself to their own trousers, you first have to understand exactly how empty the country's arsenal really was. By the early summer of 1940, Britain's situation could be described, without much exaggeration, as one of the most precarious in its modern history. The evacuation from Dunkirk between 27th May and 4th June had saved the better part of 338,000 men, but it had done so at a brutal material cost. Tanks, lorries, field guns, and above all, anti-tank weapons had been abandoned on French beaches and roadsides in their thousands, left behind because there was no time and no space to load them onto the boats. The British Army that returned home was an army of survivors, not an army equipped to repel an invasion, and invasion seemed not merely possible but imminent. German forces stood across the Channel, barely 30 kilometers from the English coast at the narrowest point, and Adolf Hitler had already begun drawing up plans for Operation Sea Lion, the proposed seaborne assault on southern England. Winston Churchill, newly installed as Prime Minister, he was telling the public to prepare to fight on the beaches, in the fields, and in the streets, and meant it literally, because the alternative, fighting nowhere, for lack of weapons, was not an alternative at all. The numbers told their own grim story. Britain's stock of anti-tank guns had been decimated. The standard Boys anti-tank rifle, issued to infantry since the late 1930s, was already proving inadequate against the armor of newer German tanks, and there simply were not enough of them in any case. The Home Guard, hastily formed in May 1940 from over 1 million volunteers too old, too young, or otherwise ineligible for regular service, was in an even more desperate position. Many units drilled with pikes, shotguns, and, in a handful of well-documented cases, nothing more lethal than pitchforks and grim determination. If German tanks came rolling up the lanes of Kent or Sussex, a frightening number of the men tasked with stopping them had no proper means of doing so at all. What Britain needed was something that could be produced immediately, cheaply, in vast quantities. using materials that did not compete with the desperately stretched supply of steel and machined components already earmarked for tanks, aircraft, and artillery. It needed a weapon that an ordinary man with a few hours of training could use to disable an armored vehicle at close range. And it needed it not in a year, not in 6 months, but within weeks. This was the impossible brief handed semi-officially to a small and rather unusual government department that most of Whitehall did not know existed. That department was MIRC, a branch of military intelligence devoted to irregular and guerrilla warfare, and it was run by a Royal Engineers officer named Major Millis Jefferis, a man whose talent for improvised weaponry had already caught Churchill's personal attention. Jefferis worked from a cramped set of offices and workshops, assisted by Stuart McCrae, a former magazine editor with no formal engineering training but a gift for solving practical problems with whatever happened to be lying around. Between them, and drawing on earlier theoretical work by 2 Cambridge scientists, Dr. Bauer and Dr. Schulman, they set about designing an anti-tank grenade built around what is known as the squash head principle. The idea itself was elegant. Rather than relying on a shaped charge to punch a narrow hole through armor, the squash head approach spreads plastic explosive flat against the surface of a target on impact, so that it forms something like a disc, or what the engineers rather memorably called a pat, before a delayed fuse detonates it. The resulting shockwave travels through the metal itself, and on the inside of the armor plate, the force flings off a shower of lethal high-velocity fragments, scouring the crew compartment without ever needing to physically pierce the steel. It was the kind of compact destructive trick the British had a real talent for during this period, achieving with chemistry and physics what they could not yet achieve with brute industrial capacity. But a squash-head charge only works if it stays in full contact with its target for the crucial instant of detonation, and that posed an obvious dilemma. A grenade thrown at a moving tank on uneven ground by a nervous and possibly undertrained soldier was unlikely to land squarely and stay there through luck alone. It was a printer by trade, Gordon Norwood, who is credited with suggesting the answer. Encase the explosive in a fragile container, coat that container in the strongest adhesive obtainable, and let the bomb glue itself to whatever it touched. Norwood reportedly demonstrated the principle to McCrae using a 150-watt light bulb, showing how a glass sphere wrapped in woven wool would stay rigid enough to throw, yet shatter and deform on impact. Early trials, slightly bizarrely, used glass flasks filled with cold porridge to test the mechanics before anyone risked the real explosive. The finished design that emerged from these experiments, formerly known as the No. 74, Grenade Mark I, was a strange-looking object even by the standards of wartime improvisation. At its core sat a glass sphere roughly 11 centimeters across, containing a little over half a kilogram, around 1.25 pounds, of a semi-liquid, desensitized nitroglycerin compound supplied by ICI. This sphere was wrapped tightly in stockinette fabric, which was then thickly coated in birdlime, a notoriously powerful adhesive traditionally used by gamekeepers to trap small birds on branches, repurposed here for considerably more destructive ends. To protect this sticky surface during transport and handling, the whole assembly was enclosed in a 2-part sheet metal casing, hinged and spring-loaded, which fell away the instant the user pulled the first of 2 safety pins. Attached to this lethal lollipop was a handle, originally turned wood and later molded bakelite, roughly 13 centimeters long, which housed the firing mechanism. A striker held in place by a safety lever and a second pin, the latter carrying a small printed label that read, with admirable understatement, "Danger, do not remove this pin until ready to throw grenade." Pulling that second pin armed the weapon. Releasing the lever, which happened naturally the moment the grenade left the thrower's hand, started a 5-second fuse, roughly the time it takes to recite your own name and address slowly before the nitroglycerin detonated. To put the scale of the explosive charge in everyday terms, Half a kilogram of nitroglycerin compound is roughly the weight of a small bag of sugar, an unremarkable amount to hold in one hand and a thoroughly remarkable amount to have detonate a few feet from your body. The finished grenade, casing and all, weighed close to a kilogram, light enough to carry several at once, and the whole assembly measured around 24 centimeters in length, not far off the size of a rugby ball with a stick attached. When it detonated against armor, witnesses described a sharp, flat crack rather than a deep boom, the sound of the squash head charge doing its work in a fraction of a second, the blast strong enough in testing to blow aerials clean off a tank's hull and shatter exposed gun sights from several meters away. There was an additional complication that the design team had not fully anticipated until the weapon reached wider hands. The handle itself, positioned only a short distance from the detonating charge, could be flung backwards by the force of the explosion with the violence of a fired bullet, meaning that even a soldier who had successfully attached the bomb and retreated to what he judged a safe distance was not entirely out of danger. Reports also surfaced that the nitroglycerin compound, despite ICY's efforts at desensitizing it, tended to grow steadily more unstable the longer it sat in storage, which meant that a crate of sticky bombs left in a Home Guard armory for months at a stretch was, in a very real sense, becoming more dangerous with every passing week rather than less. Manufacturing took place across various British facilities, with the explosive filling supplied by ICI, and overall coordination handled through the Ministry of Supply, with components flowing in from a network of smaller subcontractors typical of Britain's dispersed wartime production model. The undertaking faced serious early difficulties. By December 1940, fewer than 66,000 had actually been produced, against an original projected order of 1 million, with the production rate limping along at only 5,000 to 10,000 units per week, frustratingly slow for a weapon meant to be filling an emergency gap. So disappointing was this early output that there was serious discussion of cutting the original order down to just 200,000 units, a sign of how close the entire project came to being abandoned outright before it had proved itself in the field. The fragile glass sphere proved troublesome on the production line as well as in the field, prone to cracking in transit long before it ever reached a soldier's hand, occasionally leaving a faint, sticky residue of leaking explosive on the inside of its protective metal casing. Engineers eventually replaced the glass flask with a plastic casing in the improved Mark II version, a change significant enough that the weapon was effectively redesigned around it, and one which finally satisfied the Ordnance Board sufficiently for the grenade to be accepted as a standard service issue in 1941. Despite the rocky start, production eventually accelerated, and by the time manufacturing wound down in 1943, more than 2.5 million sticky bombs had been built, a genuinely enormous number for a device that had begun life as a deeply unconventional notion, sketched out by a magazine editor and a Royal Engineers major working against the clock. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. In practice, the sticky bomb was always meant to be a weapon of ambush rather than open battle, and that is largely how it was used. Home Guard training manuals were explicit on this point. A user was to conceal himself in a ditch, hedge, or slit trench, allow an enemy tank to pass, and then dash out to attach the bomb to the rear or side armor, where plating was thinnest, before retreating swiftly enough to avoid the blast radius. It was, by design, a weapon for roadblocks, ambush positions, and night raids on parked vehicles, and the training notes even suggested it could be dropped from an upstairs window onto a tank passing below, which gives some sense of just how close quarters and improvised its intended use really was. Confirmed combat use is harder to pin down with precision than the production figures might suggest, partly because so much of the documentation around irregular and Home Guard operations from this period remains scattered or was never systematically recorded. What is reasonably well documented is its use by regular Commonwealth forces in North Africa, where conditions suited the weapon rather better than the muddy lanes of southern England. During the fighting around El Alamein in 1942, accounts describe British and Commonwealth soldiers using the sticky bomb against German Panzer, 3 and 4 tanks at close range, targeting tracks, engine decks, and optics in an effort to immobilize rather than necessarily destroy. In the Pacific Theater, Australian troops reportedly carried the weapon during the fighting at Milne Bay in New Guinea in August 1942, though its signature adhesive struggled badly in the humid, frequently waterlogged conditions there, since the bomb simply would not stick properly to wet or muddy surfaces, a flaw the original designers had noted but never fully solved. The psychological dimension of the weapon is, perhaps unsurprisingly, almost entirely unrecorded from the German perspective, and any claims about enemy morale effects should be treated as informed speculation rather than established fact. What survives far more vividly are British and Commonwealth accounts of the weapon's effect on its own users, which ranged from wary respect to outright dread, since everybody who handled one understood, at some visceral level, that the most dangerous moment of using a sticky bomb was not throwing it at the enemy, but holding it themselves. It is worth pausing here to compare the sticky bomb with what other nations were doing to solve the same problem, because the contrast is genuinely instructive. Germany, facing similar anti-tank shortfalls in certain theaters, relied heavily on the Hafttoladung, a magnetic hollow-charge device that clamped directly onto armored surfaces using built-in magnets rather than adhesive, a solution that sidestepped the entire sticking-to-the-user problem but introduced a different vulnerability, since German tank crews quickly began coating their own vehicles in Zimmerit, an anti-magnetic paste, specifically to defeat magnetic mines. This is, incidentally, one reason the British design relied on glue rather than magnets in the first place. The Americans, for their part, pursued a different solution entirely, developing rifle-launched anti-tank grenades and, later, the rocket-propelled bazooka, which kept the user at a considerably safer distance and reflected America's deeper reserves of industrial capacity for producing more sophisticated ordnance. Compared with these alternatives, the sticky bomb looks less like a triumph of engineering and more like a stopgap of genuine ingenuity, a weapon that achieved a real tactical purpose using almost no advanced materials or precision manufacturing, at the cost of accepting a level of risk to the user that no peacetime designer would ever have signed off on. It was, in the truest sense, a product of its moment, brilliant in its simplicity, alarming in its execution, and only possible because the alternative in 1940 was nothing at all. Assessing the true historical impact of the sticky bomb requires a certain honesty about the limits of what can be known. Its material effect on the war, in terms of tanks actually destroyed, was almost certainly modest, since it was always a supplementary weapon rather than a primary one, issued widely to the Home Guard precisely because better alternatives were unavailable, and used by regular forces mainly in specific, close-range situations where heavier anti-tank guns could not be brought to bear. Its psychological effect, both on the British public and on the soldiers who carried it, is considerably easier to assess and arguably more significant. For an island bracing for invasion in the summer of 1940, the simple fact that anything existed which an ordinary man could use against an enemy tank mattered enormously to morale, even if that something came with the rather large caveat of being faintly hazardous to its own operator. The weapon's reputation for danger followed it for the rest of its service life and beyond. As late as 1962, a buried cache of 50 sticky bombs was discovered near a railway line at Aldershot Garrison, the explosive having grown unstable after 2 decades underground, and 2 members of the Royal Army Ordnance Corps were awarded the George Medal for safely disposing of them, a quiet coda that confirms just how seriously the weapon's volatility was still being taken nearly 20 years after it left production. The grenade was formally declared obsolete in January 1946, quietly retired once Britain's anti-tank arsenal had been properly rebuilt, and it never saw the kind of widespread post-war adoption that some other wartime designs enjoyed, in part because the very flaws that made it so memorable also made it a poor candidate for any army with the luxury of choice. Its influence on later anti-tank weapons is similarly difficult to state with great confidence. The squash head principle at its core did not disappear with the sticky bomb itself. The same basic concept of spreading explosive flat against armor before detonation resurfaced in later high-explosive squash head shells used in tank guns well into the post-war decades, though the direct lineage from a hand-thrown adhesive grenade to a gun-fired shell is more a matter of shared principle than documented inheritance, and historians remain cautious about drawing too straight a line between the two. What is far less ambiguous is the weapon's place in British popular memory, where its combination of genuine wartime desperation and almost slapstick danger has made it a recurring touchstone, referenced in post-war fiction and even comedy. A reflection of how quickly a deadly, serious stopgap can curdle into folklore once the danger it was built to answer has passed. Surviving examples can today be seen in museum collections including the Imperial War Museum. Preserved now as historical curiosities rather than threats, the birdlime long since inert, the nitroglycerin long since removed. So we return to that workshop behind Whitehall, to the crack of a test detonation rattling windows on a May evening in 1940, and to the strange truth at the heart of this story. The sticky bomb was never meant to be a good weapon. It was meant to be an available one, and in the desperate calculus of that summer, availability outweighed almost every other consideration the designers might otherwise have cared about. It was glass where steel would have been safer. It was glue where a magnet would have been wiser. It was, by the candid admission of the men who built it and the soldiers forced to carry it, a weapon its own inventors regarded with something close to nervous respect, because they understood better than anyone exactly how easily it could turn on the hand that threw it. And yet it worked, often enough, and existed in numbers, more than 2.5 million of them, large enough to matter when the alternative was nothing at all. It armed a frightened, under-equipped nation at the precise moment that nation most needed arming, asking each man who carried one to accept a small, very personal risk in exchange for the chance to do real damage to an enemy tank. That trade, uncomfortable and faintly absurd as it sounds today, was the entire logic of 1940. Not the best weapon imaginable, but the only one available, built fast, feared by the men who made it, and carried anyway. The trousers, as one Home Guardsman dryly recalled, were in rather a state after the explosion, though to be fair, they had been in rather a state before it too. Britain in the summer of 1940 was much the same. Imperfect, improvised in rather a state, and still somehow standing.